There is a photograph taken at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu in the spring of 2018. An old man in a dark suit is bending down beside a white marble marker. He is 94 years old. He is 5 feet 6 inches tall. He has a Medal of Honor pinned to his lapel. His hands are shaking, just slightly, the way an old man's hands shake when he is trying very hard to hold something inside himself and cannot. The name on the marker is Charles G. Fischer, Private First Class, United States Marine Corps, killed in action on Iwo Jima, February 23, 1945. The old man is Herschel Williams. He has flown 7,000 miles across the Pacific to stand beside this grave. He has waited 73 years to do it. He does not speak. He puts a hand on the top of the marker. He stays there for a long time. Somewhere out in that same cemetery, or somewhere in the vast bookkeeping of the American war dead, is another name Williams knows. Corporal Warren H. Bornholz, another Marine who died on the same island on the same morning in the same 4 hours. These are the two men Williams could not save. For 77 years, when anyone asked him about the Medal of Honor around his neck, he gave the same answer. He gave it to reporters, he gave it to presidents, he gave it to school children and to Gold Star mothers and to his own grandchildren. It doesn't belong to me. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall. The Marine Corps had rejected him for being too short. They came back later and asked if he would carry a weapon most men refused to touch. Roughly 70 pounds of pressurized fuel strapped to his back. Around 7 seconds of continuous flame per tank. A walk into direct machine gun fire over and over until the Japanese defensive line collapsed, or he did. This is the story of what happened in those 4 hours. And of the 77 years he spent carrying it home. If your father served in the Pacific, if he came home and never talked about it, if he woke up in the middle of the night for the rest of his life and never told you why, if he kept a folded flag in a drawer he would not open on holidays, then you already know part of Herschel Williams' story. You know it in the silences. You know it in the empty chair at the table on the anniversary of a day nobody in the family knew the meaning of. You know it in the man who came home from the war and never quite came all the way home. This is his story, but it is also every one of theirs. Before we can understand what happened to a young corporal on the morning of February 23, 1945, we have to understand why the United States of America decided that a piece of black volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific was worth dying for. At the fall of 1944, American B-29 superfortresses were flying bombing raids from bases in the Mariana Islands to targets in mainland Japan. The distance was 1,500 miles each way. The airplanes were flying at the edge of their range. Anything went wrong over Japan, engine damage, fuel loss, structural failure from anti-aircraft fire, and a crippled B-29 had almost no chance of making it home. It would ditch in the ocean. The men aboard would die. Right in the middle of that 1,500-mile route sat Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, 2 operational airfields, a 3rd under construction, radar stations warning Tokyo of incoming raids. Japanese fighters based on the island were rising up to attack American bombers on the way in and on the way home. If the Americans could take Iwo Jima, they could shut down those fighters. They could shut down the radar. And they could give their crippled bombers a place to land. That was the arithmetic. That was why 30,000 United States Marines were going to walk down the ramps of landing craft onto black sand on February 19, 1945. That was why nearly 7,000 of them would not walk off the island alive. Before the battle was over, the airfields on Iwo Jima would become emergency runways for more than 2,000 B-29s. Approximately 24,000 American airmen would land on Iwo Jima at least once between March 1945 and the end of the war. Many of them would land there because they had no other option. Many of them would have gone into the ocean without it. Every Marine who died on Iwo Jima died so that those airmen could come home. Herschel Williams did not know any of that on the morning of February 23rd. He knew there were pillboxes in front of him and a flamethrower on his back and men behind him who were counting on him to move. The sand was black, not brown, not gray. Black, he could taste it. That was the first thing he noticed when he pressed his face into it, the taste. Volcanic grit between his teeth, sharp and mineral, a taste like sucking on a copper penny. The cinder had been cooking under the Pacific sun since before dawn. It was hot enough to burn the palms of his hands through his gloves. 70 pounds of pressurized fuel sat on his back. A rubber hose ran from twin steel cylinders to a nozzle in his right hand. Above his helmet, no more than a foot above his helmet, machine gun rounds split the air with a sound like ripping canvas. He was 21 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and he was in the open. For a moment, in the pause between one burst of fire and the next, his mind did something strange. It went home. He was 11 years old again, standing in a farmhouse kitchen outside quiet Dell, West Virginia. His mother, Lorena, was at the wood stove. His father was 3 days into the influenza and would be dead by nightfall. Herschel was one of 11 children. His hands smelled like the milking barn. There was snow on the window. There was a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in the newspaper on the kitchen table. He was 17, driving a lumber truck on the winding roads outside Fairmont, listening to Bing Crosby on the AM radio. He was 19, standing in a Marine Corps recruiting office, watching the sergeant behind the desk shake his head and say the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "You're too short." Then the machine gun opened up again, and he was 21 years old, face down in black volcanic sand, and none of it mattered. Somewhere in front of him, Japanese pillboxes sat in a staggered pattern across the plateau. Their machine guns had been firing since dawn. His company had not moved in hours. The men behind him were watching. The men beside him were bleeding. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. On the map, it looked like a pork chop floating in the Pacific, 650 miles south of Tokyo. On the ground, it was something else entirely. The sand swallowed boots up to the ankle. It swallowed tank treads up to the axle. It absorbed sound and radiated heat and offered nothing in the way of cover. There were no trees. There were no rivers. There was one dead volcano at the southern tip called Mount Suribachi, 550 feet of jagged rock that gave the Japanese a view of the entire island. And beneath that black sand, an elaborate network of tunnels. The man who had built that network was named Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was 53 years old, tall for a Japanese officer, serious. He had lived in America. In the late 1920s, he had served as a deputy military attaché in the United States. He had driven across the country in a used car. He had traveled through Kansas and Texas. He had studied at American cavalry facilities. He had seen the factories in Detroit. He had seen the wheat fields stretching all the way to the horizon. He knew what he was fighting. In the letters he wrote to his wife Yoshi in Tokyo, letters that would not become widely known until decades after the war, Kuribayashi did not speak of victory. He wrote to his young son Taro. He wrote about the drafts under the doors of the family home and told his wife to have them fixed before winter. He wrote about the vegetables in the garden. He asked Taro to be a good son, to take care of his mother. He knew Japan would lose. He knew he would not go home. His job was to make the Americans pay for every yard of black sand. He had roughly 21,000 men. He had concrete pillboxes with walls several feet thick. He had machine guns positioned in interlocking fields of fire. He had mortar spotters on Suribachi. He had spider holes camouflaged with sand. He had tunnels connecting his positions. He did something else that shocked his own officers. He forbade the traditional Banzai charge. For decades, when Japanese soldiers were about to be overrun, they had risen out of their positions in a final, screaming assault, running at the enemy with fixed bayonets, choosing death over surrender. It was a doctrine of honor. It was also, from a military perspective, a way of dying quickly and giving the enemy an easier day. Kuribayashi did not want an easier day for the Americans. He wanted each of his soldiers to kill 10 Americans before he himself was killed. He ordered his men to stay in their tunnels, to wait, to ambush, to move underground and reappear behind enemy lines. He wrote a code of conduct for the defense of the island and had it distributed to every man under his command. His officers were told that anyone who died without killing 10 enemies would be dying in vain. He was going to turn Iwo Jima into a machine for killing Americans, and he almost did. On February 19, 1945, 30,000 United States Marines had come ashore. By nightfall of the first day, roughly 2,000 of them were dead or wounded. On the morning of February 23rd, 4 days later, the advance inland had been measured in yards, and every yard had cost blood. Somewhere in that advance, moving north with the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division, was a corporal who should never have been there at all. He was born on October 2nd, 1923, in a farmhouse outside Quiet Dell, West Virginia. His parents named him Herschel Woodrow Williams. He was one of 11 children, though not all of them lived. 3 of his siblings had died of influenza before he was born. He grew up knowing that death came through the house, whether you invited it or not. His father milked dairy cows. His mother raised chickens and children in roughly equal numbers. There was a photograph of his father on the wall of the farmhouse. When Herschel was around 11 years old, the influenza came again, and his father died. The farm did not stop needing to be worked. Herschel milked cows before school and after. He learned to drive a truck young because his family needed someone to haul lumber, and there was nobody else. He grew up shorter than his brothers, shorter than most of the boys in his class. By 17, he stood 5 feet 6 inches tall in his boots, and that was as tall as he was ever going to get. His older brothers enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Herschel tried to follow them. The Marine Corps recruiter looked him up and down and shook his head. The minimum height for the Corps at that time was 5 feet 8. Herschel was 2 inches short. The recruiter did not soften it. He simply said no and moved on to the next man in line. Herschel walked out of the recruiting office and went back to civilian work, driving a truck, doing what needed to be done, waiting. He would tell the story his whole life. In interviews, in speeches, in conversations with grandchildren, he never made it sound like a hardship. But there was something in the way he told it, a small, quiet thing underneath the words, that suggested he had never quite forgiven the world for saying he was not enough. It took time. That is how long it took the Marine Corps to lower its standard. By 1943, casualties in the Pacific were climbing so fast that the height requirement was lowered. Herschel walked back into a recruiting office. This time, nobody shook their head. He was in. He went to boot camp in San Diego. He trained further in the Pacific. He served briefly on Guadalcanal, where the fighting had ended months earlier, but the mud and the malaria had not. He was eventually assigned to the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division. He was trained on demolitions and on a weapon most men refused to touch. The M2-2 Flamethrower, roughly 70 pounds of steel and pressurized fuel, twin cylinders on the operator's back filled with thickened gasoline, an early form of napalm. A smaller nitrogen tank between the fuel cylinders provided the pressure. A rubber hose fed a nozzle. A spring-loaded igniter cartridge produced the spark, somewhere around 7 seconds of continuous flame. That was all one tank could give you. 7 seconds, and you had to be close, which meant that a flamethrower operator had to cross open ground under direct machine gun fire, close to within a stone's throw of a concrete pillbox, and stand upright long enough to aim the nozzle and pull the trigger. Every enemy soldier behind that firing slit could see his face. Every enemy soldier had reason to shoot the flamethrower operator first, because a single round through the nitrogen tank could rupture it and turn the man wearing it into a walking bomb. On the Pacific Islands, flamethrower operators measured their survival in minutes. Herschel Williams saw his first combat on Guam in the summer of 1944. He was still alive in February of 1945. By then, he was one of the few flamethrower men in his company who still was. The 3rd Marine Division had originally been held in reserve for Iwo Jima, kept on ships offshore in case the fighting on the beach went badly. On the second day, the fighting on the beach had gone very badly. The 3rd Division was ordered ashore. Williams walked down the ramp of a landing craft into black sand, and the smell of burnt cordite and diesel, and something else, something sweeter, that he would learn was the smell of dead men in the sun. The beach was already a graveyard. Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions who had gone ashore on the 19th were still there, some of them in shallow depressions where they had fallen. Corpsmen moved between the bodies with morphine and bandages. Landing craft that had been hit by Japanese artillery burned in the shallows. Sherman tanks sat useless in the soft sand. Every yard of the beach was covered by Japanese fire from positions dug into the high ground above it. Williams was 21. He had trained for this. He had thought he was ready. Nothing on Guadalcanal had been ready for this. He moved inland with his platoon over the next 2 days. He saw men he had trained with die. He saw men he had never met before die. He saw a Marine sitting upright against a berm, apparently uninjured, apparently resting, and then he saw that half of the Marine's back was gone. He did not have time to be sick. There was never time for that. On the morning of February 23rd, 1945, Company C of the 1st Battalion, 21st Marines, had run into a defensive network that had stopped their advance cold. Reinforced pillboxes sat between them and their objective. Their machine guns were positioned to cover each other's approaches, so that firing at one drew return fire from others. Sherman tanks could not reach them. The black sand was too soft, the terraces too steep. Naval bombardment had failed to crack the concrete. Airstrikes had left the network intact. The company had already lost men trying. Williams' demolition section had taken heavy losses that morning. His platoon needed someone to go forward with a flamethrower and burn the positions out. Williams was the man who could still do it. He would say later in interviews that he did not remember volunteering. He did not remember what was said. He remembered putting on the flamethrower. He remembered the 4 Marines who stepped up to cover him. Some he knew, some he did not. He remembered the weight on his back and the buckle of the hip belt against his pelvis. Then he remembered standing up. Behind him, roughly 1,000 yards to the south, 6 Marines from another battalion had raised, or would soon raise, a second American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi that same day. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal was about to press the shutter on a camera. The image he was about to capture would become the most reproduced photograph of the war. Every American who lived through the next 50 years would see it. It would appear on postage stamps. It would be carved into bronze in Arlington. 3 of the 6 flag raisers in that photograph would not live to see the end of the battle. Nobody would ever see a photograph of what Herschel Williams was about to do. He took his first step forward. The machine gun opened up. The first round missed him. He heard it before he felt it. A crack in the air just above his shoulder. So close it moved the fabric of his jacket. He dropped flat. The volcanic sand was still warm from the previous day's sun. He pressed his face into it and waited for the second round. The straps of the M2-2 cut into his shoulders. He could feel the buckle of the hip belt grinding against the top of his pelvis. His right hand was going numb from gripping the nozzle. Somewhere under his jacket, sweat was running down his spine in a slow, steady line. The flame itself would burn at somewhere around 1,000 degrees Celsius. That was not the important number. The important number was what napalm did when it landed. It stuck. It stuck to concrete. It stuck to steel. It stuck to skin. It stuck to clothing. And it consumed all the available oxygen in an enclosed space within seconds. Williams knew all of this. He had been trained on it. He had used it on Guam. He had seen what came out of a bunker after a flamethrower had finished with it, and what came out was not something a young man from quiet Dell was built to forget. But there was something else he had been trained on. The nitrogen tank on his back was, effectively, a bomb. Every enemy soldier had been told the same thing. Shoot the flamethrower operator first. Shoot for the tanks. Williams was carrying his own funeral on his back. He crawled forward. What happened next? Over the next 4 hours, Williams himself would spend the rest of his life trying to remember and mostly failing to. He would say in interview after interview that after the first pillbox, most of it went blank. He did not remember individual decisions. He did not remember the geography. He remembered fragments. Heat, weight, fear that came and went and came back again. The face of a Japanese soldier, the smell of the fuel, the taste of the sand. What we know is what the men who covered him and the men who watched him from the company line put in their reports. He crossed the open ground. He reached the first pillbox and put fire into it. He came back for another flamethrower. He crossed the open ground again. He climbed onto the top of a bunker at one point and put the nozzle of the flamethrower into a ventilation shaft so that fire could pour down into the sealed concrete space from above. He did that more than once. It became a technique. It worked because the crews inside were looking out through their firing slits, and their firing slits did not point up. He came back. He got another flamethrower. He went out again. At one point, during those hours, a group of Japanese riflemen with fixed bayonets tried to stop him. His Medal of Honor citation would later record it in a single hard sentence. He grimly charged enemy riflemen, who attempted to stop him with bayonets and destroyed them with a burst of flame from his weapon. He charged them, not the other way around. A man carrying 70 pounds of fuel on his back, whose weapon was nearly empty, ran at soldiers with bayonets. And the burst of flame he had left was enough to stop them at close range. He would not talk about that moment for 50 years. When he finally did, he did not describe the fire. He described only that afterward he could not stop thinking about the men in the tunics. American intelligence officers going through the pockets of Japanese dead on Iwo Jima in the days that followed would find things. Photographs, prayer beads, folded letters written in careful ink addressed to wives and mothers and children in villages back home. Letters that had been sealed, letters that had been waiting to be mailed. Whether the men Williams killed carried any of those letters, no one will ever know. But something about the possibility of it stayed with him. He kept going. He used multiple flamethrowers across those hours. He came back to the company line for reloads again and again. When he ran out of flamethrower tanks, or when a position needed something different, he used demolition charges, blocks of explosive that had to be placed by hand at close range and detonated. What his company commander could see from the rear, watching through binoculars, was that the enemy fire was slackening. Positions that had been active all morning were going silent. The interlocking pattern that had pinned the company since dawn was breaking down, one bunker at a time. Williams was not just killing men in bunkers. He was breaking the geometry of Kuribayashi's defensive plan with his own body. Every position he destroyed exposed the flanks of the ones around it. Blind spots opened up. Approaches that had been suicide became possible. The whole network had been designed on the principle of mutual support, and mutual support only worked as long as most of the supporting positions were alive. By the time Williams walked back to the company line for the last time, the guns on the company's front were silent. His uniform was scorched. His hands were blistered from the heat of consecutive flame gun discharges. He had been under direct fire for something on the order of 4 hours. 2 of the Marines who had covered him were dead. Their names were Corporal Warren H. Bornholz and Private First Class Charles G. Fischer. Williams did not know that yet. In the confusion of that morning, in a company that had been taking casualties for 4 days, on an 8-square-mile island where 7,000 Americans would eventually die, he did not know exactly who had fallen or when. He knew there had been men behind him. He knew some of them were not walking back. He would carry that not knowing for years. And when he finally learned the names, he would carry those too. The battle was not over. Iwo Jima would grind on for another 33 days after the morning of February 23rd. 33 days of the same slow, murderous advance through volcanic rock and hidden tunnels. 50 yards forward, dig in, take fire. 50 yards more, Williams kept fighting. On March 6th, 11 days after the Pillbox assault, a Japanese mortar round detonated near his position. Shrapnel tore into his legs. Medics carried him to a beach aid station. From there, a landing craft took him to a hospital ship anchored offshore. His war on Iwo Jima was over. Of the flamethrower operators, the Marines committed to the battle, only a small fraction walked off the island alive. Williams was one of them. On the other side of the island, in the final days of the battle, General Kuribayashi's forces were being destroyed. He had lost most of his men. He was down to a few thousand. His tunnels were being burned out one by other men in other companies doing what Williams had done. Kuribayashi sent a final message to Tokyo. Historians disagree about the exact wording of what he said, but the tone was unmistakable. His men had not eaten. They had not drunk water in days. They would fight to the end. He apologized to the emperor for failing to hold the island longer than he had. He signed the message with poems he had written for his own family, 3 short verses, the traditional form for a Japanese officer preparing to die. His body was never conclusively identified. He was 53 years old. He had a wife named Yoshi. He had a young son named Taro who would grow up without him. Somewhere in Tokyo, they were waiting for news that would take a long time to come, and when it came, it would not include a grave. 2 men on 2 sides of a line drawn by other men doing what they had been told to do. Williams was still recovering on Guam when the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, the Japanese surrender on August 15th. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, the operation his division had been training for, never happened. He would not have to do it again. None of them would. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a piece of paperwork was moving through channels. Williams did not know about it. He had never asked for a medal. He had asked when he could bring himself to ask anything about the men who had died covering him. Nobody in the company at the time could give him a clear answer. 2 Marines behind him, both killed, their bodies recovered. Their names had gone into casualty logs somewhere, but in the fog of a battle that killed 7,000 Americans, no one had yet connected those 2 names to that specific action. He carried the not knowing. He would carry it for years. On October 5th, 1945, Corporal Herschel Williams stood in the East Room of the White House. He was 22 years old. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. There were more than a dozen recipients in the ceremony that day. Williams was one of only a handful who were physically able to accept the decoration in person. Most of the others had been killed in the actions that earned it. Their medals were being handed to widows and mothers. Williams had been sick for days before the ceremony. A bad chest cold. He had taken cold medicine before walking into the East Room. He would say later, in interviews recorded decades afterward, that the day passed in a blur. The sense that everything was happening to someone else. Truman spoke to each recipient briefly. Williams would remember that the president expressed deep respect for the men who had earned those medals, especially the ones who had not lived to receive them. Williams did not feel like he had earned it. He felt like he was standing in for other men. Not long after, Williams married Ruby Meredith in West Virginia. Ruby was young. It was the fall of 1945. Bing Crosby was on the radio. American brides that year were often wearing dresses sewn from parachute silk. There was rice on the church steps. He was home. To everyone who looked at him, he was home. Nobody saw what came next. He got a job, he kept it, he showed up, he said the right things, he put the Medal of Honor in a box and did not talk about the war. He drank, almost every night, at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. Sometimes he drank until he could not drive home. Sometimes he drank until the memories went quiet, and sometimes he drank and they did not go quiet at all. Ruby waited up. She had married a man who had come home from an island she could not find on a map. She had married a man whose hands sometimes shook for no reason she could see. She would go to bed alone, and she would wake up alone, and in the morning he would come in, and she would not ask him where he had been because she already knew. She was 20 years old. She had a wedding photograph on the mantel. She had a husband she loved. She was learning something about what love was going to have to look like for the rest of her life. It was going to have to look like waiting. The nightmares came in waves. He dreamed about the vent pipes. He dreamed about the sound of nitrogen hissing through a valve. That sound, the specific mechanical hiss of a pressurized gas cylinder, could stop him in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in a hardware store, in a garage, at a gas station. He would freeze. His hands would start to shake. Ruby learned to recognize the look on his face and steer him toward the door. Ruby gave birth to 2 daughters, Travi and Tracy. Williams was there for the important things. He was a good father in the ways he knew how to be. But there was a distance in him that his daughters would only understand years later when the world finally had a name for what was wrong with their father. Post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1945, they called it battle fatigue. In 1945, they told men to go home and get back to work. In 1945, they gave a 22-year-old boy a medal for burning 7 pillboxes and put him on a train back to West Virginia and expected him to be a husband. He was surviving. He was not living. This went on for years. In 1962, he walked into a Methodist church in Huntington, West Virginia. He would tell the story simply. He was invited. He went. Something happened. He would not describe it in dramatic language because Williams was not a dramatic man. But when he walked out of that church, something had shifted. The nightmares did not stop. They never stopped, but he found a framework for carrying them. Faith did not erase what he had done. It gave him a way to live alongside it. He would serve as the national chaplain of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society for the next 35 years. In 1969, after 20 years of total service, Williams retired from the Marine Corps Reserve as a Chief Warrant Officer, Grade 4. He took a job with the Department of Veterans Affairs. For 33 years, he sat across desks from other veterans. Korea veterans, Vietnam veterans, men who had come home carrying the same weight he carried, only they were younger and it was fresher and they had not yet learned how to hide it. Williams helped them file claims. He helped them find doctors. He helped them find each other. He knew what they carried because he had carried it himself. At some point during those years, other Marines helped Williams look through service records. It took years. It took more than one person. Eventually, someone with access to a database ran a search that had not been possible before, cross-referencing the casualty rolls of the 21st Marines for February 23, 1945, with the men attached to Company C, 1st Battalion. The two names came back: Corporal Warren H. Bornholz, Private First Class Charles G. Fischer. Williams was in his 60s or 70s by then. He had been carrying the not knowing for most of his adult life, and now, finally, he knew. He wrote the names down. He did not go on television with them. He did not put them in the newspaper. He did not stop giving the same answer he had always given when someone asked him about the medal. "It doesn't belong to me. I wear it for two Marines who gave their lives protecting me." Sometimes he would add, "I don't even know their names." He was speaking a deeper truth underneath the literal truth. He had learned the names on paper, but the men themselves, who they had really been, what their voices had sounded like, what their mothers had called them at the dinner table when they were boys, that he did not know, that he could never know. And so, in the deepest sense, he did not know them. The medal did not belong to him. He was just holding it for them. In 2010, at the age of 87, Williams founded the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation. Its mission was singular: Gold Star families. The mothers, the fathers, the wives, the children, the siblings of American service members who had died in combat. The people who had been left behind. The people who had received the folded flag at the graveside. The people whose loved ones had been Corporal Bornholz and Private First Class Fischer in 1,000 different battles in every American war since the founding. By the time Williams died, the foundation had erected more than 100 Gold Star families memorial monuments in parks and cemeteries across nearly every state in the country. Each one was a black granite monument with a soldier's silhouette cut through the stone. Each one bore the same message. Each one stood in a place where a family could go and touch it and know their loss was seen. In January of 2016, the United States Navy announced that Expeditionary Sea Base Ship No. 4 would be named the USNS Herschel Woody Williams, 90,000 tons of steel, longer than 2 football fields end to end. The 5'6" farm boy from quiet Dell now had a warship bearing his name. The vessel was commissioned in 2020. Williams attended the ceremony. He was 96 years old. He wore his dress blues. 2 years earlier, in 2018, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Huntington, the same facility where Williams had counseled veterans for over 3 decades, was officially renamed in his honor. That same year, he traveled to Hawaii. He was 94 years old. The trip was 7,000 miles. He had to change planes. He had to be helped through airports. His body was slower than his memory. His memory was still very fast when it came to certain things. He went to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, the cemetery Americans call the Punchbowl, dug into the crater of an extinct volcano in the hills above Honolulu. 45,000 American war dead are buried there. Rows and rows of white markers on green grass, curving with the shape of the crater floor. From the rim of the Punchbowl, on a clear day, you can see Pearl Harbor. Williams was helped through the gates. He was helped along the rows. He stopped at the marker for Charles G. Fischer. He bent down. His knees were bad. His hands were shaking. He put his hand on the top of the white marble marker. He said out loud some words that had been waiting 73 years to be said. What exactly he said he would keep to himself, but he had made it there. He had come across the Pacific one more time. And this time, he had not come to fight. He had come to say thank you. Also in 2018, he stood at midfield in Minneapolis and tossed the coin before Super Bowl 52. 14 other Medal of Honor recipients stood beside him. He was one of 11 children from a dairy farm in quiet Dell. He was standing on a football field in front of 100 million television viewers with the Medal of Honor hanging from his neck. The camera lingered on his face. He looked in that moment like a man who had lived a very long time and had earned every year. In June of 2021, Williams made his final visit to Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island, South Carolina. He wore his dress blues. He served as the honorary official for a graduation parade of several hundred new Marines. Marching in one of those formations was Private First Class Cedar Ross, Williams' great-grandson. Ross had earned a meritorious promotion during training. When the drill instructors had discovered whose blood ran in the young recruit, the chief drill instructor had pulled Ross aside and told him he had big shoes to fill. The shoes belonged to a man who stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. On June 29, 2022, Herschel Woodrow Williams died at the medical center that bore his name. He was 98 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Second World War, the last of them all. When the news broke, the President of the United States ordered flags flown at half-staff. The Commandant of the Marine Corps issued a statement. So did the Governor of West Virginia. So did the Speaker of the House. But the tributes that mattered most did not come from Washington. They came from the Gold Star families whose monuments Williams had built, from the veterans he had counseled at the VA, from the drill instructors at Parris Island who had told a young recruit named Cedar Ross that he had big shoes to fill, from the great-grandchildren who had grown up climbing into his lap and asking him what the medal was for and being told, every time, the same answer: it doesn't belong to me. On July 14th, his remains lay in honor in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. He was one of only a handful of American citizens who were not a president or a member of Congress ever to be given that honor. Williams was buried in Huntington, West Virginia. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago. The Gold Star monuments he built still stand in parks and cemeteries in nearly every state. At his funeral, in Marine Corps dress blues, standing at attention beside the flag-draped coffin, was Private First Class Cedar Ross. The young Marine's white gloves were clenched at his sides. He was looking straight ahead. He was not crying. He was doing what his great-grandfather had taught him to do. He was holding it. And somewhere in the Marine Corps casualty records from February of 1945, 2 names are still there: Corporal Warren H. Bornholz, Private First Class Charles G. Fischer. 2 young men from somewhere in America who ran into open ground with M1 Garands and stood up long enough to make Japanese machine gunners duck. 2 men who died so that a 5'6" corporal from quiet Dell could crawl close enough to a pillbox to end it. Williams learned who they were. He carried them for 77 years. He flew across the Pacific in 2018 to stand beside the grave of one of them and say the words he had been waiting most of his life to say. He wore the Medal of Honor for 6 decades, and every time someone asked him about it, he told them the same thing. The medal did not belong to him. He was just holding it. He was holding it for the men who did not come home, especially for 2 of them. Their names should not be forgotten. Corporal Warren H. Bornholz, Private First Class Charles G. Fischer. 2 Marines who stood up in the open on the morning of February 23, 1945, so that a man who had been told he was too short for the Marine Corps could open a path through the deadliest island in the Pacific. They never came home. He never forgot. This story is not just his. If your father served in the Pacific, if your uncle came back from Guadalcanal or Peleliu or Okinawa or Iwo Jima and never told you what he did there, if there was a folded flag in a drawer in your family home, if there was a name nobody spoke at the dinner table, if there was a silence at the end of grace on Thanksgiving that everyone at the table understood but nobody ever explained, then this is his story too. Herschel Williams spent 77 years remembering 2 men so that we would understand something. The medal was never the point. The 4 hours on Iwo Jima were never the point. The point was the ones who did not come back. The point was that somebody has to remember them. He did that job for as long as he could. Now it is our turn.